This is Literature Out Loud at Dalnavert Museum, the Extra-Sodes.
So today I am talking to Dr. Andrew Burke, who is the Associate Professor for the English Department at the University of Winnipeg. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us for our second Extra-Sode.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Great. I'm excited to talk to you. This will come out after we've listened to chapters 3 and 4 of The Time Machine. So, for all you people listening, we didn't do this in order. Yes, you are listening to us in the future, I guess, and we are in the
Seems
past now.
appropriate.
Yes, exactly. Our time travel is appropriate. So we are time traveling. But so we're going to be talking about a few different things. We don't want to deliver any spoilers. So, first question I want to ask you is can you talk a little bit about the appearance of the machine that the time traveler creates and rides into the future? What does it look like, and what can you tell us about it?
It by the cinematic adaptations of it, especially the 1961.
Oh
So
yeah.
it's almost as if I have to like shake loose that cinematic influence on how I picture it. But I'm not going to entirely shake it loose because I kind of like how uh, the 1960s versions imagines it.
Oh yeah.
So I did do my due diligence and I went back and looked at the chapters where it's introduced to see exactly what Wells says, but still stuck in my head is the kind of sleigh-like time machine that's in the 1960s version that has like amazing levers because levers are a key part of all this and kind of like the machine aesthetic
Yeah.
that Wells perfectly articulates. But then also the kind of like key detail I think of the description is he describes it as having a saddle, which is so great, just in terms of like on one hand it has this connection to I don't know, horse riding or something like that, but then also sleighs. But I can't help but think when I hear the term saddle about bicycles and sort of the neat coexistence in the 1890s of sort of the rise of science fiction and sort of the Wellesian science fiction and the rise of the bicycle as well. And in my heart of hearts, I kind of wish the time machine looked a little bit more like a bicycle, just because it's almost as if they seemed like, I don't know, it would be a neat synergy or a neat 1890s crossover to have it that way. But as I said, sort of it's much more sort of influenced in my mind, at least, by the film version from 1960s, where it very clearly is some kind of modified sleigh with a spinning disc on back, with
Oh,
nice levers at the front, and a cool odometer that will tell him exactly where in time he's gonna land.
wow.
The other super interesting thing from the book itself is Wells mentions some of the component parts of the time machine in terms of ivory and
Mm.
nickel and quartz and things like that. And that's just interesting to me because even though this is a work of science fiction, that uh, the the main uh, the main episodes of the novel that are set in the 1890s are in this sitting room where these men get together to talk science and philosophy and whatnot. There is always that connection to the world outside and that connection to the colonies, the connection to these kind of mineral extractions that make something like machine making possible, right? So there's a whole Victorian empire behind this time machine that is there in its smallest details and its smallest component parts, and that's a kind of fascinating little detail too.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't even consider that being kind of a big part of how the time machine was created, is using these materials that they wouldn't have had in Britain, but
Yeah.
would be, yeah, it's kind of a and the colonial aspect.
Yeah,
of the
yeah.
time machine.
I have to say too, sort of like my favorite part is, especially with the opening, is that we get the time machine, but we get like a miniature time machine first. Like, I'm going to show you this very small model of the time machine, but don't worry, I already have it made. Right? It isn't the model because it's not some kind of like small scale prototype for something he's going to build later. It's already back there.
Right,
Uh,
he is the model as well.
yeah. So, I mean, the model is part of the way that Wells sets up the plot in terms of doing this little experiment to show the kind of disbelief in the time travelers' interlocutors in the room. But so it plays a key part in that. But I do like that brief delay in the actual introduction of the full scale proper time machine as well.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Um, cool. Well, it makes me want to go and look at some pictures from the 1960s adaptation and check out that time machine.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, it's always a question of like with science fiction, what shape do time machines take, and inevitably it is going to be in coordination with, or even parasitic on, the technologies of the time, or even the transportation modes of the time, or the conveyances of the time. So of course, in Back to the Future, you have it as a DeLorean.
yeah,
Uh, you know, and at other times it may take other forms and shapes, because you can always see the authors or the filmmakers wrestle with, okay, if I'm going to think about a time machine, I'm going to work with the kind of like image vocabulary or machine vocabulary of the moment that I'm living in, but I'm going to I'm gonna make it fancier. So
yeah,
that's why I like the idea of the Wells time machines being a slightly juiced up sleigh.
yeah. Just I'm saying. And it's interesting. I wonder if it has anything to do with how one might actually travel through time, taking like a transportation vehicle, if that would even work. Not that time,
Yeah,
like I don't know if time travel would work, but you know what I mean? Like,
totally this idea that like I suppose that okay, even if they're in the first chapter talking about the four dimensions, right? If somehow the spatial dimensions are comprehensible in terms of beginning to understand whether via bicycle, sleigh, train, or balloon, how to go back and forth and up and down,
yeah,
uh, sort of what do we do with this fourth dimension of time, and how do we travel through that? And the solution often is, well, I guess it's going to be something kind of similar to how we travel through the other three dimensions. So maybe a sleigh.
yeah,
I
yeah.
like it too. The other thing sort of that I always remember from the film is that it's set around the new year, which I mean is appropriate if you're gonna have this thing around time. Have it so that it is at the change of the year. Actually, in the film, it's at the change of the millennium. It's 1899 going into 1900.
Yeah.
So it is snowing outside and stuff. So the sleigh seems appropriate in that way too. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
you
yeah,
would need it anyway because it's winter
yeah,
time.
yeah, for sure.
Obviously. And just in case there's snow where you're going.
Yeah, no, if there's snow in like what is it, 802-701, it's like
Yeah,
yeah,
it'd be perfect. Uh, so what we're learning now is that the Victorians were very inventive.
yeah.
Um, and when we think about actual machines that Victorians created and used, what comes to your mind?
Oh wow, that's a that's an interesting question. I guess like on one hand, I mean, since I do work a lot on film and television, I think of screen technologies
Mm,
and image reproduction technologies. So undoubtedly, like the Victorian inventiveness in terms of creating technologies, apparatuses that can, replicate or reproduce an image reality is extraordinary. And I mean, certainly the cinematograph, thinking about that as a late 19th century invention, that was very quickly imported and adopted into England, into the UK more generally. It is a super interesting one, just in terms of like my favorite 19th century one, whether you think about it as
Cinematograph is, just quickly in case somebody doesn't know what that
oh, the film camera, the
the
film camera.
film camera. Okay.
Yeah, but of course, I mean, none of these things come out of nowhere, if you see what I mean, just in the sense of there's a whole set of image making technologies, from the magic lantern to the camera obscura, that come before the cinematograph or the bioscope or whatever other moving image technology that is there in the 19th century as well. So thinking about that as like just this incredible long era, both within the UK or within England and beyond it, of thinking about how technology could be harnessed to create machines that would allow for the reproduction of an image reality. It just blows my mind. So that's, on one hand, that's my go-to answer. Sort of, I'm always amazed by 19th century inventiveness in that regard, and specific kind of like Victorian inventors within the UK who are part of that series of image experimentations. But also sort of like, I also like to think about technologies in the bigger sense as well, thinking about the machines that enabled the Victorians to do big infrastructural projects, whether it is tunneling underground to devise like a sewerage system, say from the 1850s or 1860s, or even like we think about it as distant from today, but if we think even about what we're doing now with Zoom, everything that we're doing right now, having this conversation online, relies on undersea cables. And the Victorians were at the very forefront of developing ways to lay undersea cables for them, for telegraphic communication, in order to make this kind of at a distance communication possible. So even though maybe that isn't kind of machine as in the same as a film camera or a cinematograph, it is part of Victorian technology that I think is totally fascinating, because it has such a still tangible kind of impact on how we live our own contemporary technological lives.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, all that, how we communicate and wanting to communicate with far-reaching places, and now communicating through time, with the time machine and everything. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Just think about all the ways in which the Victorians developed technologies, from the train to the telegraph, that sort of sought to transform the experience of space and time, being able to send messages with relatively instantaneously,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
as well as being able to travel distances which completely transformed kind of understandings of geography and proximity, right?
Mhm.
It's like, wow, as soon as you can take a train, it's like the world is fundamentally different.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
so faster than horse travel,
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Wow, yeah. And so, apart from the film camera and undersea cables, underground,
No, don't go with undersea. I think there's actually
undersea cables.
there's even a book very recently called The Undersea Network. So
Oh well, there you go.
undersea is exactly the right term.
Okay. Do you have so? What is your favorite Victorian machine? And it could be an imagined one, like something from a film. Say it was. I guess you could say the 1960s time machine if you wanted.
I mean, like, on one hand, I have to be loyal and say, oh, it's still my favorite sort of 19th century machine remains the film camera or the film projector. Sure, that blows everything out of the water, just because
Yeah.
I think completely transforms everything thereafter. And a total shout out to the camera as well. Thinking about the history of Victorian photography is totally fascinating, just in terms of not simply the ways it was used in a documentary sense, but in an aesthetic sense as well, how quickly that was, but then also in an everyday sense too, allowing people to see themselves or to retain images of themselves is totally incredible when you think about it, just in terms of going from painting to photography, from
For sure.
one kind of stabilization of the image to another is fascinating. But I suppose that's a kind of cheating because
Well, I think I'll accept it because what an amazing thing. I still I think I am in agreement with you. It's just an amazing thing to have. Like we have little cameras now in our pockets and take videos every day of things that we want to
yeah.
retain. And like there was a time when you couldn't do that and there was no option to do that.
Yeah, and I mean, somehow it seems appropriate as well, just because the Lumiere brothers in France sort of have their first screen projection film exhibition in 1895 as well. So it perfectly coincides with the time machine. So somehow the time machine is very timely in the sense of it arrives and participates in this moment where you have technologies and machines fundamentally reorganizing the experience of time and space, right? What is film other than a machine for a machine for time travel, right? All of a sudden you have the ability to record and preserve images that you can subsequently project somewhere else. They literally move in time and space. So it's kind of brilliant in that way. But then also, like I always like to think of communication and transportation technologies as the same thing. I've already showed it out the train, just in terms of how incredible a Victorian technology that is, the growth and expansion of something like the railway network. I've already showed it out the bicycle as well, just in terms of how that transforms space and time, especially urban space and time. Thinking about late 19th century London that Wells was familiar with. So those kinds of technologies are too. I guess the last thing maybe to bring up is, like, I don't know, the system of public transit and stuff, like thinking about trams, whether horse-drawn or other electric, thinking about the ways in which those fundamentally reorganize our experience of the everyday world. I mean, the time machine is about time travel, and it is this incredible novelistic philosophical experiment to think through some of the ramifications or the consequences of this should it be invented, in terms of thinking about society, thinking about politics, thinking about gender relations, thinking about all of these things. But it doesn't come out of nowhere. It's not a pure thought experiment. It comes out of a society and a culture that was already kind of in the midst of experiencing time and space differently. Wells is just able to, again, harness that and create a fiction to push the thought experiment further, to think about it in a much larger scale. Going forward, I guess, to 802-701, this almost like impossibly unimaginable distant point in the future.
Yeah, it's quite a long time. It wasn't just a little bit into the future. It's very far.
Yeah, no, sort of like a lot of science fiction is like totally modest in terms of like, oh, I'll think of like 1952 or something, but no, or like the year 2500. But Wells was having none of that. He was like way forward.
Going for it, yeah.
Yeah.
So you're talking about society and being in the midst of these changes and new inventions and stuff and new technologies. So what can you tell us about how people responded to these things? So we know how Wells responded, but society in general, the advent of the film camera, like how is the reception of these kinds of technologies?
I think that's a super interesting question, just in terms of just from attendance and the desire to go to these exhibitions. I think we have a historical record of an enthusiasm for these new types of technology that are at once part of or very quickly become part of an entertainment industry, but then also sort of have this relationship to actualities and participate in just allowing people to see things that hitherto they wouldn't have been able to see, right? So there's all of this. I don't know, I always tend towards cliche in answering this type of question and end up saying something like, well, surely it's a mix of optimism and apprehension, sort of anytime new technological things are introduced, just in the sense of you can see, and surely they saw some of the possibilities of how it would transform or even improve everyday life in the Victorian period. But at the same time, presumably as well, as with many technologies today, there's an apprehension about whether these changes are going to be positive changes, right? So you have that in the immediate circumstance, right, where you have moral panics about the introduction of new technologies. And again, so I'll go back to the bicycle example, the moral panic about ladies having bicycles and whatnot, and how that will affect everything is part of the reaction and relationship to the introduction of new technologies. But then what Wells does in The Time Machine is, like, in an incredible way, just elongate that kind of thinking about, well, what are the long-term ramifications of the introduction of these kinds of technologies, but then also of the society that was forming around and because of them, right? If the Time Machine, I don't think this is a spoiler, if the Time Machine is a piece of fiction that engages in a very profound way with the key political debates and dilemmas of the day, especially in relation to labor relations, you know, you can see how Wells is thinking through this in terms of how that organizes itself around technologies and machines, but then also in thinking about how technologies and machines give shape to and participate in the society that surrounds him. And the Time Machine becomes this thought experiment, this incredible thought experiment in thinking about the very, very, very long-term kind of consequences and ramifications of this.
Yeah. We'll get there. We'll get there in the novel. You'll see.
Yeah, I did my best not to do any spoilers there. So.
No, you did great. You did great.
I coached it in the vaguest terms possible.
Yeah, I think it'll just make people super interested in keeping on listening.
Yeah, they'll know it's coming up.
Yeah. So yeah, we were avoiding spoilers, which is great. We're doing a good job. Like you were saying, with people's reactions to technology and stuff, would you say overall, in your experience with working in the 19th century, No, your work in
the 19th century?
you time travel, right?
I don't know. It's hard with, as soon as you read Wells and as soon as you read The Time Machine, prepositions become very, very difficult.
Yeah.
In, on, through. There's a way in which we're still working through the 19th century as well, just in terms of, like, a lot of the stuff that Wells brings up sort of remain like tangible political questions too, about society and about how we think about the future as well, and about how we live our lives in the present in anticipation of an imagined future too, right? So yeah, in, on, for, we'll accept, and through. We'll accept all of it.
Okay, great. So with that in mind, were the Victorians in general pessimistic or optimistic about the future? Were they excited for all these new things, or were they, I guess it could be both things, because there's
No, you've totally anticipated the answer, which is, like, I don't know, a little from column A, a little from column B, right? They were probably very, like, person to person, group to group, social milieu to social milieu, class to class, you know, all these things. Like, there isn't necessarily one homogenous experience of a relationship to the future. I'm sure it was mixed. I mean, the thing, if they're not mixed, they're not feelings, right? And I'm sure they had mixed feelings about all these things. But I mean, I think we can probably say a few things. Certainly, Wells is at the literary forefront and whatnot of thinking about the future. And I think one thing that we can definitely say about the late 19th century, especially, is that it's an era that was incredibly invested in thinking about the future, right? Whether optimistically or pessimistically, it is still, I think, important just to have that future-oriented kind of mode of philosophical reckoning and thought happening. And a lot of it comes of like political desire to change the world. So if you want to enact or promote a political program of some sort of why you have to have some vision of a desired future towards which your program might lead or might aspire to, right? So you do get that a little bit in Wells throughout his work, not just in The Time Machine, trying to imagine the future he himself desires. But then the verso to that recto is always like, it can go dark very quickly as well. Sort of like the inevitable companion of utopian thinking ends up being dystopian thinking, right? Or how one can collapse into another. Sort of, if you sketch out a utopian vision, how quickly can it sort of flip somehow and become something it's quite terrible, or how quickly it can become something that is not desired rather than desired, right? So I think in a way that's the oblique answer to the question. Sort of the super interesting thing about the Victorians, especially the late Victorians and Wells in particular, is sort of this impulse to think about the future, even compulsion to think about the future, that kind of drives a lot of his writing. And surely some of that comes down to the sense of it being the end of an era or the end of a point as well. So we ourselves suffered through some millennial anxiety recently, so we can probably turn our minds back to the fin de siècle and think about how sort of rather arbitrary kind of calendar sort of turnovers catalyzes or invites this kind of like big political reckoning of what's to come, the shape of things to come, to steal the title of another Wells things. Yeah.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. It's a lot to think about. So I have a final question for you. Your doctoral work was on the Victorian period, but you've recently published a book on Canadian culture of the 1970s and 80s, including TV and film culture. It's a shout out to the hinterland.
Yeah.
Looking it up. But given your experience in film and TV, can I ask you about the Time Machine's screen history? Now, you gave us a little bit with the 1960 version, but I think it's had a few different film companies try to.
Yeah, absolutely. And it does have like it does have like a media history to it. I know that there's a bunch of radio adaptations of it that happened as well, but I'm more familiar with the film ones. There was a late 1941 in the very early days of television, actually, that the BBC did, which I haven't seen. I don't even know if it survives, actually. But the canonical one is the 1960 version that I already mentioned, which was directed by George Powell, who was a Hungarian emigre, worked first in the UK, but then went to Hollywood and was involved in the production of an adaptation of War of the Worlds in 1953. So he was already familiar with Wells by the time he gets to the production of The Time Machine in 1960. And he was known for and an expert in animation and stop motion animation. Throughout the 1940s, he made a bunch of films that relied entirely on that. So you get some of that in the film of The Time Machine, particularly in the time travel sequences themselves. Sort of what he'll do is have all these optical effects and animation effects that allow us to try to imagine the sensory experience of something like time travel. And I think Wells does like a great job in the work of fiction to describe that in prose on the page, to get a sense of how disorienting something like time travel would be, just in terms of the sensory and bodily experience of it. What Powell was able to do was to give that a kind of real visual force through these animation techniques that he had developed sort of in his earlier work. So that's the first fascinating thing. But the 60s, or the 1960 version of the Time Machine, I think is totally fascinating, because it comes at a particular point in Hollywood production where it's a nice kind of Technicolor Saturday matinee film. It's a rip-roaring time travel adventure in a way. And I can't give too much away from the end of the novel or where it goes and kind of the action sequences that come up later in the novel. But even in the early parts, it really indulges in the kind of like campy lushness, the recreation of the Victorian scenes, and particularly the discussion the men have around dinner, imagining these Victorian types having this discussion, whether it's the amateur botanist, or whether it's the newspaper editor, or whether it's the gentleman scientist like the time traveler herself. So there's a kind of real satisfying Hollywood representation of the late Victorian period in that. But then also sort of with the unveiling of the time machine itself, it's meant to be this scene of kind of real wonder and fascination, right? That's seen from the vantage point of the 1960s, a much later age, but you can really see the effort of the film both to create a kind of like period specific 1890s kind of like adaptation of the time machine, but one that comes from the vantage point of the 1960s, knowing that in a lot of ways, what Wells was writing about in the 1890s has unfolded very differently. And one of the things that the film does, instead of having the time traveler go straight to 802-701, the impossibly distant future, is he experiments a little bit with the time machine itself, landing first, I think in 1917, where he's horrified that World War I is going on, and just obviously landing within the trauma of the Great War itself, but then also sort of landing, I think in 1944 as well. So into World War II and sort of the air raid sirens and having to go into the underground from the bombings of London, and then has, even though it's a 1960 film, has the time traveler land in 1966, where there's also sirens, because there's an imminent now I feel as if I'm giving spoilers from the film, because there's an imminent nuclear attack, right?
Oh yeah.
So I mean, there's kind of interesting things the film does that isn't, strictly speaking, it isn't fidelity to what Wells wrote, but it is an effort to try to rewrite Wells in a way that's sympathetic to some of the thought experiments that Wells was obviously engaged in. The other weird thing about the 1960 version is that the time traveler is played by Rod Taylor, who went on to be the main guy in The Birds, the Hitchcock film, just a few years later. So when I see the time traveler, and I watched it again very recently after not having seen it since I was a child, was, oh yeah, that's Mitch from The Birds.
Yeah. Oh wow.
But he's like, I don't know if when you're reading the novel, you imagine the time traveler as a kind of hunky but harmless 60s matinee star.
Yeah.
But that's kind of how it is with Rod Taylor in the 1960 adaptation of The Time Machine. There is a more recent adaptation of The Time Machine too, from 2002, which I think was directed by Wells's grandson, along with Gore Verbinski. They might have co-directed it or something. And it has Guy Pearce, the Australian actor, as the time traveler. But that version is not very good.
It's not good. Okay.
Yeah.
Nobody watched that.
Yeah, no, I would say sort of like somehow the 1960 version, even though, it's a bit it's a bit campy and corny in places, and it goes in some weird directions in terms of solving things later on in subsequent chapters that we won't talk about. Nevertheless, it is still the most interesting of the adaptations, I think.
What are they getting so wrong? Like, what would be a really, I guess this is a question that maybe cannot be answered, but what would be the best version of the time machine movie? I don't know. What is the biggest problem? This is maybe a question for the end of the novel. But what is the biggest problem with moving it to film?
Oh, everybody reading at home, as they get in later chapters, I think they'll readily see the problems with how to adapt this to something like a live action feature, right? Yeah. I'll just leave it vague, such as that. But I'll also say sort of maybe the other obstacle that Hollywood faces in adapting something like The Time Machine is the problem of a love interest, right? How do you, Hollywood needs for its male protagonist to have a viable and on-screen kind of
romance or interest
kind of thing going on, and there's certain ways in which the way the plot of The Time Machine unfolds makes that kind of hard to do. So yeah, it's vague. I've always thought like there could be a great animated version of The Time Machine. It calls out for a Studio Ghibli Japanese kind of anime adaptation of it that has like a real kind of, because I mean, there's ways in which late Victorian aesthetics and steampunk and whatnot is all over Japanese anime already and Studio Ghibli productions. So there's a real kind of compatibility on that level between the two of them. But then also, I think just in terms of like the representational possibilities in animation. And I mean, Powell was partially there because he's using stop action animation in his version of it. But how it could be done with drawn animation or computered animation is a real possibility too. So even though there have been sort of screen adaptations of The Time Machine already, maybe we're still waiting for the one in the future that will be the one, right? It is a kind of time machine premise to imagine that that's still to come.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The best one is still to come.
Yeah,
I like that Studio Ghibli. I think I can already see it happening.
Yeah. I want it to happen now that I've mentioned it.
Well, pitch it. You'll have to send a pitch.
I think I have my elevator pitch ready to go. Right. I was practicing on you right now.
Yeah, exactly. Sold.
Yeah, good.
So is there anything else that I'm missing? Is there something you'd like to say about The Time Machine through the lens that you look at it in that I haven't asked?
Like, let me just say, I often teach a science fiction course, and like my default teachable in that has been War of the Worlds, because the War of the Worlds it's a great Wells novel. It's like there's so many details in there that give the students, and every time I read it, I see them and learn about them again as well. Sort of small details that give you profound insights into the everyday life of like late Victorian or turn of the century culture, but then also of the social, political, and philosophical dimensions of the time that Wells was living in. So it's a very satisfying novel to teach because of that, and also because of the science fiction scenario that it presents has been everywhere taken up. But now, having just read The Time Machine like recently, like to prepare for this, really, I'm sold on that too. Like it's such a rich piece of fiction, just in terms of providing insight into the historical period in which it was written, but also very much setting the table for a whole raft of science fictions to come, right? I'm sure as you're reading it, like you're seeing, oh, that's where that trope comes from, or that's where that convention comes from, or that that turns up again here. I've already mentioned Back to the Future, but if you even just think about sort of the whole range of time travel fictions, even screen fictions, all of them have their debt to Wells, not only in terms of solving the dilemma of how to represent the machine, and solving the dilemma of how to represent the actual transport through time, but then also in terms of what it allows you to do, right, as an author or as a director or as a screenwriter, sort of in terms of thinking about and using the genre to think about the period in which you're living, but then also to speculate on a future to come, right? And a future to come that isn't just going to come because it comes, but because there's a potential there for it to be shaped in some way positively by the things you do in the present, or the decisions you make in the present, whether as an individual or collectively as a society. So it's a very, it's made me question my default sort of science fiction test. Should I always be teaching War of the Worlds? Or should I be teaching the Time Machine? Because it just offers a few different things than War of the Worlds in terms of the questions that it raises, both in terms of the history of the genre, but then also about the relationship between the genre of science fiction and culture and society.
Yeah, you make a great case for it. So maybe you'll have to look at.
Yeah, no, I'm convincing myself.
Yeah.
So I have to make a strong case to convince myself.
War of the Worlds is great. We did a radio version of it at Dalnavert last year for
Oh,
Halloween.
yeah.
Yep.
But you know how great that is too,
Yeah.
in a slightly different way.
But it's and Time Machine is different. It's there's no aliens coming. It's all
Yeah,
based in the world, and so yeah.
yeah. And in its own way has been sort of so rich in terms of like variants and remakes, and sort of just using the time machine premise to think through different things.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, we
yeah,
get
yeah,
that because of Wells, and so yeah.
yeah, yeah. Really just foundational in so many ways.
Mm,
Yeah,
fantastic. Yeah,
cool.
that's amazing. I didn't know the Time Machine, and now I'm hooked. I'm hooked on it.
Yeah, no, it is, and it's additionally sort of like, as much as I love the long Victorian novel, there's something very satisfying about something that you can read in a sitting, right? Just because it has you from the beginning,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah,
And it is something that that once you're immersed in it, you want to keep going.
yeah. Gotta
Yeah,
find out what's that feature like.
yeah.
Well, thank you so much for talking to me today. It was very fascinating, and thank you for sharing all of your expertise and ideas with us.
No problem. It was a pleasure to talk to you and talk to a little bit about machines, and about the time machine in particular. And I, I'm no Wells expert, but I'm a Wells enthusiast, right? It is interesting to read what he's written, and I think even for everyday readers, like the questions that he raises are just fascinating and kind of still with us.
All
So,
right.
so much.
Thank you.
Okay.